Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, or is it the Groundwork podcast, or maybe it's the Kate Kavanaugh show. I really don't know anymore, but what I do know is that I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you most weeks. I have a bit of a long intro today. At the beginning of this year, I wasn't quite sure who we were going to have on the podcast and what we were going to talk about. And what I decided to do was to let go, let myself be curious. It's been one of the guiding principles of this podcast. Throw a lot at the wall and just kind of see what comes out. And as I flipped through some upcoming books to see if anything piqued my fancy, something came up that really surprised me. And it is this incredible book, Homestand by Will Bardenwerper, who is my guest today. And it is about, of all things, baseball. And I surprised myself. I am not much of a sports ball girl unless it's football and it's played in the snow, which I guess makes me a Bills fan. But this book is about so much more than baseball. This is about community. It is about crossing divides and creating bridges within our spaces and our hearts. It is about so many of the themes that we've explored about the emptying of rural towns and spaces when industry leaves them. And at its core, what Will has done in this beautiful narrative nonfiction, where it's very much about this small town in Western New York, but it's also about Will himself. And it's about so many of these incredibly memorable characters that show up through the book as we traverse a summer in Batavia, New York, where the Muck Dogs are playing. And what is happening is that Major League Baseball is shutting down so many of the minor league teams that really made the fabric of sort of yesteryear America. And they're being sold off to private equity. And this is a story that will be really familiar to those of us in farming or in manufacturing or in any industry right now, right? This is about the big guys kind of crushing the small guys. And what happens in Batavia is that they decide to form a summer league of college ball players. And what happens in this town is nothing short of beautiful and heartwarming and incredible. And this podcast episode teases at so much of what we've been getting at about community and efficiency and loneliness and big business and rural spaces, which is so much of the reason that became very passionate about this book. And I just had the most delightful conversation with its author, Will. And I wanted to actually tease out in the episode, Will and I are talking some about weather and about community. And for those of you, so I'm recording this, it's March. Yesterday, I was in New York City and it was 60 degrees outside and I felt like a whole new person. I can see the ground outside of my office window for the first time in probably 3 or 4 months. And I can feel summer right around the corner. And for those of us that live far north or, in very cold spaces, March is just a season of absolute renewal. And The weather features heavily in this book because Western New York in particular is so snowy and gray. And I brought in this quote from Hannah Close, who runs a really beautiful Substack called Metaxio. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes. She has this beautiful quote that I come back to a lot about small talk and the weather. And I know a lot of us are quick to say that we're not interested in small talk or that we hate having small talk, but this is in defense of small talk. And I think as we tug at these themes of bridging divides within communities and really coming together, maybe this is really the perfect quote to open this episode with. And so in it, Hannah says, social skills drop away when you're alone for so long. In the same breath, it's like riding a bike, except the wheels are coming off. Perhaps I mean social scripts, not skills, relational prescriptions. Still, chit chat is in our DNA. Small talk gets a bad rap when it's actually a crucial part of relating with other humans. Are you bored of talking about the weather? Hell no. The weather is life. The weather is our bodies and the larger body we collectively inhabit. Expletive talking about quantum physics and existentialism. Let's talk about the weather. Well, the former two if you're into it. Small talk can express itself as a performance, a cool distance from your interlocutor, as a form of avoidance. But it is also expressed as a form of care, of attending to the minutiae of living in a place in ways that are explicitly bound to the land. Run out of fuel, need more water, candles, food. It's the end of the quote, and I thought I'd bring that in because I think that one of the things that I found really profound about Will's book Homestand, which is out today and you should definitely pick up a copy of, is that there are these conversations that are happening in the bleachers that are deepening over games, over months of a summer, and then over the years that these people spend together. And I just really am increasingly aware that I want to build in-person community in this space that I live that is full of a lot of people that have different beliefs and politics and ideas than I do. And just how mission critical I find that. And we talk a lot more about that inside of this episode, which really is fantastic. If you are enjoying this podcast and you are ready for what I am calling the box of chocolates that you never know what you're going to get in upcoming episodes with some incredible authors and ranchers and creators, then please hit the subscribe button and follow the show. And if you could just leave a little rating, takes 2 seconds, but it really helps people find the podcast, I would be ever so grateful. And just a shout out to our incredible sponsor, Redmond Real Salt, when you can get 15% off with my code mindbodysoil_15 by going to redmond.life. It is becoming the season of saltiness, and I am ready for it. And with that little sales pitch, little tongue in cheek there, I want to bring you this episode with Will Bardenwerper and his new book, Homestand, Small Town Baseball and the Fight for the Soul of America. I'll hit record and we'll just kind of ease in because I think that makes it feel a little bit easier.
Okay.
But front porches, I have a quote about front porches, so we'll get to front porches. I've actually thought a lot about them this week since reading the book, which I have to. And so let me start this off by saying I just loved the book, and I just became so immersed in Batavia and all of these characters and your writing. And I think as we come out of this gray and very cold Northeast winter, it really got me excited for Bluebird days and in warmer months.
No, well, thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It's funny you mentioned that because in the book, I do quite often, I think, refer to the weather to the point that my editor was like, all right, we can't always just introduce the scene with like what a beautiful evening it was. And I think there was one early review that was very favorable, but like one critique was Bardenwerper seems obsessed with the weather, and maybe I was, but I think for good reason, because like you said, Western New York, is just it. I mean, I thought Pittsburgh weather was kind of grim in the winter, and then I started traveling up there, and I'm like, wow, it's like the one part of the country that will have no sympathy for me because it's just gray and gray and gray, and then you introduce feet of snow on top of that, and so the weather really was important because these beautiful summer evenings are in such short supply that they're really special. It's I
Yes.
think maybe someone who lives in like San Diego would just not derive the same meaning from it because it's something that they're accustomed to. But in Batavia, it's like I think they're just acutely aware of how transient these nights are, and therefore they really really appreciate them.
Yeah, they become somewhat of an anchor. It's interesting. I was reading an essay by an essayist named Hannah Close, and she was talking about how people relegate the idea of talking about the weather to small talk, but really
uh
the weather is us, right? It's this extension of the environment that we live
hmm
in. And I think a
hmm
lot about living this far north, how much long winters create a sense of urgency and a sense of presence in those warm summer nights that you just
hmm
want to soak up. And I think the book
hmm
really captures that, and that the weather is an important character.
Yeah, no, thank you, I agree.
Well, I think we ought to frame this conversation for people a little bit because, like we were talking about before we hopped on, I think my listeners will be really familiar with some of the principles and ideas of this book, but through a completely different lens and one that was very new to me,
Uh-huh.
baseball. And so I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what is happening in minor league baseball and this
hmm
sense of consolidation and how you come to the Batavia Muck Dogs
hmm
as the subject.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the first thing I would say, to your listeners that is important and something I try to make note of is, I wouldn't even call this like a baseball book, so to
Mm-mm.
speak. I mean, there's certainly baseball in it, but I think it comprises probably like, less than 20% of the content. But yeah, I kind of use baseball as a lens to examine some of these other things. But the consolidation aspect of it is important. And I guess we could back up to 2020, or it's 2019 really. The fall of 2019, I was living in Denver, and I heard about these rumors that Major League Baseball was looking to dramatically cut its number of minor league affiliates. And so again, for listeners who aren't familiar, historically major league teams have had these farm teams spread across smaller cities and towns in America. I mean, back in like the 50s, when this was developed, there were even more. There were like maybe 300.
Yeah. Yeah, I was
Now,
struck in the book. I think you mentioned maybe even over 400.
yeah, I mean, this was like a defining characteristic of small town America, and it's kind of gradually condensed over time until 2020 when there were 160, and the rumor was that they were going to cut down to 120. So I thought to myself, well, what would be a really neat story would be, and they were going to do it after that last season. And so I thought, I'll just go. One of the leagues that was scheduled for elimination was the Appalachian League, which is it was like 10 teams spread across West Virginia, North
Mm.
Carolina, and Tennessee. And so I thought, you know what I'll do? I'll spend a summer kind of embed with one of these teams, get to know the players and the fans, and tell the story of kind of the end of this century-long tradition. Well, as I think all of us probably remember, what else happened? The January of 2020, COVID emerged, and so um, it was kind of a slow process. Like everyone, we didn't know really what was going to happen, but it began to look like it was less and less likely that there would, in fact, be a final season because things were gradually beginning to get shut down out of COVID concerns. And so that is, in fact, what happened. There was no minor league season for the first time in, decades.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was no final season. And then shortly thereafter, the rumors came true. Major League Baseball did cut these 40 teams, and the communities really never even had a chance to say goodbye. And with that went what had been a successful book proposal to write this book about the final season. Well, there was no final season, so there was kind of no book. I was able to sort of resurrect the idea in the form of a magazine article for Harper's, telling the story of the Appalachian League and what happened without, obviously the ability to go to these games. And then sort of fast forward into how we got here with this book. One of the people who read that article was Bill Kaufman, who's a character in the book that I write about.
It's an incredible
and
character too.
Yeah, thank you. And he wrote to me, just, he contacted me off of my website, and he said, "Hey, Will, I loved your article. It really resonated. It reminded me so much of this team that we have in our community, or that we had. They lost theirs as well. And would you like to come up here? I'll buy you a beer. Just be nice to talk." And it's 4 hours away from where I live outside Pittsburgh to this town, about 45 miles to the east of Buffalo. So I said, sure, thank you so much for reaching out. I'd love to come meet you. And I got up there, I met him, and kind of the rest is history. That was the sort of the kernel of an idea that led to this book.
Well, I mean, I think it's incredible, and I know that we talked a little bit before we hit record, because it really details just how much these minor league teams are woven into the fabric of small town America as a place where people can come together and enjoy one another's company and have these sort of deepening relationships. Both, I was struck, over the course of a season, but also compounding over the course of many summers of spending time together. And the book is just full of these characters that are coming to Dwyer Stadium, where the Muck Dogs play, and their bonds that are across industries and across politics and across all of these different things. They're all coming here for this sport in summer and to be together, and that it's more about what happens in the bleachers than what happens on the field. I hope you're enjoying this episode with Will Bardenwerper about his book Homestand, a beautiful deep dive into the world of baseball and community. And with that, I have a little sales pitch, if you will. And yes, that term does come from baseball. I looked it up. With spring right around the corner, I'm feeling pretty salty, and my go-to salt is Redmond Real Salt. Redmond Real Salt is mined right here in the USA from an ancient seabed in Utah and is packed full of 60+ trace minerals. It's what I use in everything, from seasoning those first greens of spring from the garden to the last carrots and beets from last season, because it brings out the nutrient-rich flavor of all of my favorite foods while being a nutrient in and of itself. I'm also leaning heavily on their Relight hydration powder, Redmond salt with magnesium glycinate and coconut powder in incredible flavors. Right now I'm really loving the crayon apple. As the weather starts to warm and I'm spending more time working outside and getting into harder hikes and workouts for the season, I know right now I need to be hydrated and replenished for all the work here on the farm. I also want to add to this, and this comes from the bottom of my heart, that this is the kind of company that is building community in a way that is setting a big example for what is possible when we reimagine the way we do business. And I got to find this out firsthand when I visited with Redmond Real Salt in Utah last October. I am so proud to have them as a sponsor of the show. You can get 15% off using the code MindBodySoil_15 by going to redmond.life or hitting the link in the show notes. With that, let's get back to our interview with Will.
Yeah. I mean, I think even the team to some extent was surprised by how little time I spent, in the dugout with the players, chronicling the games. And I did, my best to do that. But as the summer went on, I found myself kind of more interested in what was taking place in the bleachers and those relationships that you talk about. I'd usually try to duck down onto the field for a few innings, just to make sure I was able to keep up with what was going on in the game. And some of the players had interesting stories of their own, but, it certainly is not like a pitch by pitch account of games. I spent, out of every 9 innings, I probably spent 2 on the field and 7 hanging out with my friends that I was making in the bleachers. And yeah, I think for people who are maybe less familiar with minor league baseball or minor league sports, it's just so different from major professional sports. in so many ways. And like, just one of the examples you mentioned was the fact that it's like the same people every day. I mean, a season ticket's $99, so it's tremendously affordable, and that
Mm.
that gets you admission for like what was it, 30 nights of summer or whatever. I mean,
Yeah, it's
that would
incredible.
probably get you like one ticket, to like that wouldn't even get you one ticket to the upper deck of an NFL game,
Yeah.
and it gets you an entire season to this. And as a concept, and it's just it's logistically easy because in many cases, like in Batavia, the stadium is just kind of nestled into like a local neighborhood, so you could just walk there. Most huge professional stadiums are really hard to get to. You park super far away.
You pay for parking.
Yeah. I mean, you've paid probably $30 before you've even left the garage and entered the stadium. And one thing that I think is interesting to note too is how well the atmosphere inside the stadium. I equate more to like a family reunion or like a community picnic, because it's like the same people that get to know each other over well, they've already, in many cases, they've known each other, but those relationships kind of develop more deeply over the course of these summers. But it's also like very generational,
Mm-hmm.
to an extent that is not, I think, the case at major pro sports, where it's mostly younger people, with disposable income. I mean, it's just hard. If you think like in these games, it's in many cases, like with Bill's family and others, you have the grandparents who are in their 80s, their children who might be like 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and then their children who are like anywhere from babies to middle schoolers running around playing catch, and they're all together. And there aren't many places in today's society where you really find those groups mixing that way.
No.
So it was really, I think, special and unique.
Yeah, and you have in the book the Fanaras. I might be saying that wrong.
That's right.
Fanaras that are in their 80s.
Yeah. Raising two kids who are like my age, which I cannot even begin to imagine.
Yeah, and so you get to form these bonds that I think, and something that we've explored a lot on the podcast is sort of that we as humans are herd animals, right? But we've very much lost those local watering holes that bring us together as a herd, and how important that sense of community is to helping us feel less isolated, helping us experience a sense of camaraderie and even joy, helping, again, bridge some of the divisiveness and siloedness that I think both modern digital products that we struggled with this morning and and politics have kind of brought us into. That this is one of those last bastions of places that we can really come together, and yet it's really slipping away as it's bought up by Major League Baseball.
Yeah. I mean, you hit on so many things, like the whole, what do they call it? Like the third. There's a book, like the third place. There's work and home, and then is there anywhere else? And with COVID, and even with remote work, in many cases, there's not even work. There's just home and work are the same, and there's nowhere else. So it's like, not only is there not the third place, there's not really the second place. It's just like one place. And so
That's me.
Yeah. So having somewhere that people can kind of come out of, of that sort of digital world, and actually, like you said, have this tribe that they can kind of interact with. I think that serves, a critically important role. Maybe not for, everyone. Everyone's different, but I think a lot of us do have that innate instinct to have that opportunity. And so, so actually, I shared this book with the author of Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam.
Yeah.
And he very famously, discussed this in his book that came out, 20 or 30 years ago. And it's just, I think, become even more relevant and shows how prophetic he was. And so I couldn't agree more. And then the last thing I would note to that, or add to that, was that the two people who I found to have kind of just this contagious sort of sense of serenity happened to be the two people that did not even own. Not only did they not own an iPhone, they didn't even have a flip phone. They had nothing, and they were just so. They just seemed so peaceful, and I say this as a self-confessed sort of addict to my digital devices, but I think there really is something to be said for the fact that um, that they really they were just so happy, and I think it really added to their experience in the bleachers because they had no other distraction.
Who was this? Was this Betsy and Ginny?
No, it was Bill
Okay.
Kaufman, who, and I can't remember how this happened, but there was one night where I had planned on trying to run into him or to meet. Oh, I know what it was. Yeah, we had planned on linking up at the ballpark, and so it was like the second or third inning, and it's a small ballpark, but it's still big enough and crowded enough that like you can't immediately find someone. I figured I'll give him a call and see where he's sitting, and I'll go meet him. And I called and I called and I called and I called, and there was no answer. Assuming that he had that it was a cell number, and then finally I kind of just give up and I start roaming around, and I find him. And I'm like, hey, why didn't you answer? And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, why didn't you answer? He's like, well, my phone is, it's a landline. It's at home. I'm not at home. That's what. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, like, he's not even. I thought I was a Luddite, but he takes it to another level.
Yeah, I mean, it's a special. You called me on my landline, and sometimes I think I had to chuck my cell phone out and just revert to that because of. And I want to come back to this idea of a sense of peace that you mentioned, and I actually want to pull in. I don't know why this struck me, and I don't mean to get hung up on this, but you talk about front porches, and you talk about how architecture shifts. I have this little quick quote that I'll read where you say, quote, "The residential architecture reveals the evolution of Batavia from a walking community to a car-centric commuter one, as most homes constructed before the 1950s featured large front porches, while most built in the 1960s and later have flat fronts, an impediment to any sort of informal neighborhood socializing." And I was thinking about the peace that we associate with just sort of sitting on the front porch and having our neighbors. I'm lucky enough to farm here, and so when neighbors walk by, there's often these sort of impromptu interactions and gatherings, and I think that there is a sense of peace in those. I mean, of just sort of gathering together and having small conversations that again might sort of stretch and deepen and compound over time. And how Dwyer Stadium, where the Batavia Muck Dogs play, becomes that very front porch. Before we dive back into the episode with Will Bardenwerper, I want to give a special shout out to Bahai Grounded Footwear. Spring is right around the corner, and that means it's time to get outside for those sunny walks, hikes, and yes, maybe even a baseball game. Bahai's shoes are designed to keep you connected to the earth with grounded technology that allows electrons from the earth to flow into your body just as if you were barefoot. I have now put hundreds of miles in both my Bahai Revive tennis shoes and my Rediscover hiking shoes, and I can honestly say that they are a complete game changer. This is the shoe that I have been waiting for. Whether I'm on a morning hike or doing my farm chores, they've kept my feet comfortable, and the grounding technology is absolutely the best. With their wide footbed, flexible sole, and zero drop design, they're designed to keep your body in its natural alignment, and I can say that with full honesty, having spent many miles in them. You can use the code KATE10 at bahai.co, that's BAHE.co, for 10% off your order or by clicking the link in the show notes. Bahai's grounded technology is perfect for getting in those spring steps now that everything is thawing. And with that, let's get back to our show with Will Bardenwerper.
Yeah, no, precisely. I mean, I think one of the fans, used that exact analogy. He said that this was our front porch, and you're right. And I think I borrowed that idea. It was from a book. I don't know if it was Putnam's or a different one, but the author had kind of tried to discuss what did that the sort of evolution in suburban architecture from front porches to garages do to us as a society, and in breaking down some of those sort of communal connections that having that porch had fostered for so many years. And I mean, that's one of the reasons where I live in the little community I live called Swickley, Pennsylvania, outside Pittsburgh. One of the things I still like so much, I mean, a lot of looking out the window, some of these houses have front porches and some don't. But there's there's sidewalks, tree-lined streets, and and we can walk basically from our house, to like the little main street, which has, one or two of everything you would need, like one coffee shop, one garage, one bookstore, one toy store, one, a few restaurants or whatever.
Yeah.
And, I would take this in a heartbeat over any number of like larger houses, that are, 15 miles into like a sort of a cookie cutter suburb where you have to just get in your car to do anything. I just think there really is like tremendous value in just being able to get places on foot, to interact with other people, and not just be kind of sequestered in your like little walled compound.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's increasing I don't know, the surface area with which we have to gather and to come together. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
hard for me to say from a very rural setting, but at the same time, I do try to, we still have, and I was thinking about this too, we still have locally owned hardware stores
Mm-hmm.
and feed stores and
Mm-hmm.
and a small coffee shop in the closest town that serve as these sort of
Mm-hmm.
impromptu gathering spaces for neighbors to come together. But when we lose those to the Dollar General, to Starbucks, to chain hardware stores, we're really losing more than just that small business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. No, you're right. I mean, I this can be taken in any number of different directions, but I mean, you see it even with like, childhood, and how childhoods have evolved over time, and that connects to sports, where like even I as a
Great.
child, I lived near a playground, and that was what we did. We did our homework, and in some order, either our homework or went out to the playground after school. And it was like the little neighborhood posse of kids, that would, for us, it was, whatever sport was in season, that's what we would play. And it was, there were no parents around. It was free, obviously.
Mhm.
And it was kind of unstructured, and I think it really helped, kids to grow up. And now, there's some strange combination of kids either just being on their device, at home alone online, or to the extent there are sports, it's now become this like billion-dollar monstrosity of an industry where kids rarely, and there's some exceptions to this. Our little neighborhood, like I was talking about, actually, it is nice in that the kids kind of converge and they'll play together, and you see a little bit of that, but it's more rare. And what you see more of nowadays is, there'll be like some travel team that costs, $1,000 a season.
Yeah.
It's highly structured, super competitive from like, the age of like 7, because of course, once you're paying $1,000, you don't want your kid to be on the bench. You see it as like an investment in their development,
Yeah.
and he or she becomes like a little professional, at the age of 7, as opposed to just doing a sport because it's fun and it's good exercise and it's healthy, and you learn a little bit about sportsmanship and winning and losing. So that's just one little manifestation of how this direction that we're going.
Yeah, and you detail this in the book too. You talk about the rise of these sort of high cost to entry traveling teams for
Mm-hmm.
kids, and I think it's yet one more space that takes away. And I was struck. I did another interview about it was with Stephen Koretz, who wrote a book called American Flannel, about Bayard Winthrop's mission to manufacture a flannel shirt in America once again.
Ah, interesting. Yeah.
And one thing that he talked about is that as you had these factories and businesses go out of these small local communities, you lose so much more than that, because this is who sponsors blood drives and sponsors
Mm.
little league teams,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of brings communities together in this way. And I was
Mm-hmm.
really struck because in the book you talk about, in a sort of parallel track, that these kids teams are also becoming highly monetized
Mm-hmm.
as minor league baseball is kind of gobbled up by major league baseball for
Yeah.
something that increasingly loses its human element.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I see it with my 7-year-old son. We're more than content to just have him play on the little local rec league team that's costs like a nominal fee, and he gets together and they have fun with their neighbors. But all of a sudden, you see one or two kids beginning to migrate to like the local quote travel team, that costs a fortune. It's incredibly time consuming. You spend all your time, in the car going who knows where. And despite the fact that I recognized I played baseball in college for 2 years, and I know that this isn't required for him to become a good player. Like, he could develop just as much if I brought him to the playground myself and we played catch for an hour. But you start to see those kids do it, and it preys on that sort of fear of missing out. Like, oh boy, if Johnny's on the travel team and my son isn't, he's going to have a leg up, and next thing we know, that kid will be on the varsity team and my kid's going to get cut. And it's like, and so it really kind of almost exploits this parental desire, that everyone has for their kid to succeed and to be set up for success. And it's kind of all part of like the same overarching sort of commoditization, commercialization, because it's driven for profit. I mean, these things there was no like what's the word? There was no innate desire that parents had. Like, when they were going to the local Little League stadium, it's not like the parents sat around and said, what would be much better if we could spend $2,000 and drive, instead of driving to the local park in Pittsburgh, we'll drive to Columbus one weekend and Buffalo the next weekend. No one wanted this, but the people who did want it were clever, people, coaches or whatever. They're like, wait a second, like, we can make a lot of money if we start a team that does this, and make it year round, because that's the other thing that's going on is like this hyper specialization. You don't play 3 sports. You have to focus on one from like the moment you're born in order to be competitive at it. So it's
Speaking of fields with Will Bardenwerper, okay, maybe that was a little stretch, but I've been using my field pan for years now, and I can't think of a better companion for my one-pan dinners as I get outside to enjoy this season. There's something about the act of cooking with a field pan. It's a relationship you're embarking on, building your seasoning with every meal in a pan that is made to last a lifetime. Right now, I'm roasting chickens and the last of my storage vegetables in mine. I have the really big one, and I can fit 2, sometimes even 3 chickens in it. And I do so on a regular basis. The field pan is crafted with care. They use recycled iron, and it's made right here in the USA. It's got the perfect smooth bottom that they've machined out for cooking, and a longer handle built for better balance in your hand. I've found that over the years, no pan that I have, and I have quite a few, develops a better patina and smoother seasoning than my field cast iron skillet, which is what keeps me coming back for more. You can get 10% off your field pan by going to fieldcompany.com/Kate_Kavanaugh or by hitting the link in the show notes. It's the perfect addition to your kitchen. Durable, easy to use, and made to last. And with that, let's get back to our interview with Will Bardenwerper. It breaks my heart, and I think it teases that, and I'm gonna read you back a quote from the book, but one of the things that's come up a lot in the last year of the podcast are kind of alternative definitions of efficiencies. And we've talked about it in terms of raising goats in the Mexican countryside and in terms of water irrigation. And the idea was, and I think Cole Mannix, who's a rancher in Montana, said it really well. He said, an irrigation ditch is really efficient, right? It gets water from one place to another, A to B. And a stream does that same thing. But a stream might be called inefficient. And at the same time, it hosts all these little pockets of life that you wouldn't expect, right? Along the stream, there are all these eddies, all this places where the stream goes a little bit faster or slower and fosters different homes for different animals and creates this biodiversity and this sort of entrenched sense of community within an ecosystem. And I kept coming back to that, and I'm gonna read back to you because I was really struck by a character that is mentioned briefly in the book, which is Popcorn Bob, and how representative he is of what we lose when we commoditize and create something that's just for the bottom line. And so if you don't mind, I just want to read this quote back to you. You say, baseball has already begun to resemble yet another extractive industry where dollars are transferred from small towns to big city owners and investors. That's just how capitalism works, some contend. But if one views this as an inevitable evolution of the business, believing that baseball should aggressively pursue the same sort of efficiencies that any profitable business would, it can no longer simultaneously pitch itself as America's pastime, an institution that transcends the raw pursuit of money. When the days tolerating quote, inefficiencies, end quote,
Mm-hmm.
like Popcorn Bob are numbered,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps so too should be the days of MLB taking advantage of its antitrust exemption that is rooted in
Mm-hmm.
part on its romantic identity it has carefully cultivated.
Mm-hmm.
And I was struck by how much, I think in that irrigation ditch versus stream analogy,
Mm-hmm.
the inefficiencies are where life happens. It's where connection
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to me, that was very true all the way from Popcorn Bob making
Mm.
popcorn in the concession stand versus just ordering something on an app, right? Where you
Mm-hmm.
don't touch any humans within the ballpark.
Yeah.
And, you stay isolated to your little seat and you don't talk amongst your neighbors in the bleachers, right? That
Uh-huh.
life is happening in these bleachers at Dwyer Stadium.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you hit on so many things there, and I love that the culvert versus stream, idea like that. That's really, really insightful. I'm not gonna, I'll continue to think about that one. I'm
Yeah.
sure. But yeah, like I just jotted that. As you spoke, there were just a few different elements to that, like. Popcorn Bob himself, and this was important. I mean, this is kind of peripheral, but it's also important. Like, he also was like a tremendously kind of multi-dimensional, person. Like, and it was, like even when I met him, I think there's the tendency like just to kind of flatten him, into like this avatar of here's the hardworking guy at the popcorn machine. But he's actually
Mhm.
like he's a tremendous craftsman who he showed me pictures of stuff that he would build, by hand and sell, that was like just really magnificent. And so like just I mean, but you wouldn't necessarily expect that when you just from like looking at him, what you wouldn't know that like this is the same guy that's making popcorn for 40 years is also capable of like building things that are just like like bookcases and tables and
Mhm.
dressers and cabinets like that. I can't even put together like an IKEA thing with like instructions,
Mhm.
much less build one of these from scratch. But anyway, but as far as like the efficiency topic, um, so Major League Baseball cut 40 of these teams. The teams that survived and the behind the scenes stuff that took place was also pretty sinister. We don't even have to get into that, but be that as it may, one of the guys who was hired by Major League Baseball to make these cuts, as soon as he made the cuts, jumped ship and started a private equity firm to buy up the teams that he had spared from the cuts. That just doesn't
Sure.
smell
Yep.
quite right.
Just
Yeah,
nope.
exactly. And so in any case, now he owns he and his firm own like I think 40 of the remaining 120 with no signs of stopping. And so um
Wow.
but so you ask yourself, okay, and of course it's private equity. I mean, there's no illusion that they're driven by anything other than money and efficiency. So right now they're saying all the right things, and that to their credit, I think so far they have done kind of the right thing. They said we're going to keep the local management in place. We're not going to make any dramatic changes. This is a formula that's working. We're going to stick with it, and they may. I think they
Sure.
are, at
Yeah.
least for now. The question becomes, when the bottom line starts to struggle, and they look to continue making money, they're going to have to make some cuts. And at that point, I think this human element comes more into play. Would it be easier to fire Popcorn Bob, for example, and replace him with like a microwave and throw in a bag of popcorn? Is it easier to do that if you're the local owner like Robbie in my book, who flips burgers right next to Popcorn Bob,
Yeah.
all summer
Yeah.
long? I mean, the owner is actually literally working in the concession stand.
Yeah. Robbie and
Or
Melly were incredible.
yeah, or if you're, or would it be easier to fire them if you're sitting in a Manhattan skyscraper and all Popcorn Bob is a number on your Excel spreadsheet, and you're like, okay, well, we need to cut this many thousands of dollars this summer. Well, let's get rid of these 3 people from the concession team or whatever. So yes, things look okay, I think, right now, but looking forward, I can't imagine how this takeover is going to end well.
Well, and I think that you know, rooted in the book, right, is this deep sense of place. I think Bill Kaufman, who is
Hmm.
always bringing an incredible sense of poetry
Hmm.
into things, talks a little bit about his deep love of Batavia. This
Hmm.
I think he calls it an unlovely place,
Yeah.
on the Rust Belt that is so beloved to him. I think he calls it, oh, I have it somewhere where the place of myth and poetry and of
Yeah.
life weighed on the human scale, the only
Yeah.
measurement that
Yeah.
counts, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so much of it is how we care for a place and the people in it when it is local to us,
Hmm.
when it is the part of the fabric of our hometown and of our summers, or where we go to find a sense of camaraderie.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and it was a little bit intimidating, spending so much time with Bill as a writer because, I think he was capable of even more poetic language than, I would have even ever hoped to pull off.
Oh,
So it's kind of like
I
I'm
don't know
writing
about that.
about I'm writing about you, but at the same time, you're like tremendously gifted with words as well, and he's written a number of his own, very good books. And so that was an interesting relationship. But yeah, I mean, his love of his hometown, just kind of he just exudes it, in his life and in his writing. And it's special, I mean, it is amazing because if you do look at Batavia, no offense to Batavia, but it's like a lot of other towns. Like you wouldn't know that it was capable of exercising such a hold on someone, but then when you kind of step back and you see it through their eyes and the way that they describe it, then it starts to make sense, and then you start to realize, wait a second, like what he's saying isn't unique to Batavia. Like this is the way that people can feel about, any number of, I think he uses the word unlovely, unlovely places
Yeah.
across the country. But just because it might be sort of unlovely, to us from a distance doesn't mean that it isn't capable of having that kind of an impact on the people who are there.
Yeah, an incredible impact. And I think, I came back to, I think Bill mentions, and there's sort of a through line in the book too about this idea of homecoming, right? That Bill
Hmm.
comes home to Batavia, even though there are other towns out there. And I actually, before this episode, I went back to Wendell who's I
Oh
don't know
yeah.
if you're familiar with Wendell Berry, but
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
an agricultural writer. And Wes Jackson and Mary Berry, his wife, have this idea of homecoming. And well, it doesn't always mean coming home to where you were raised, but that we come home and we love and we find a sense of rootedness in place. And I think it's
Hmm.
by oftentimes by pouring ourselves into these spaces, right? Into Dwyer Stadium and into these relationships. And so I think there's just a love and care both of place and of the game that inspires a different sense of human scale poetry. I mean, even in the
Hmm.
announcing, I really
Yeah.
held on to that. You had a little
Hmm.
nugget about how announcing has changed, how there used
Hmm.
to be red barbarisms, these
Hmm.
sort of poetry of the game, and now it's just statistics. It's just
Hmm.
being analyzed so quickly, and there's so many statistics and numbers that
Hmm.
it's no
Hmm.
longer about finding these sort of turns of phrase. I think it was like a bunny with its tail lit on
Yeah,
fire.
yeah.
It's about how many
Yeah.
milliseconds.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a super important, it's a small point, but it's really speaks volumes. Like that, there used to be a romance to the game and a poetry and a beauty that the best announcers, could potentially, kind of capture, artfully in their description. I'll never forget my great uncle, who's a Brooklyn Dodgers fan in New York, when he grew up, and he would always tell stories, sitting in his bedroom listening to the Red Barber on the radio, describing the game, and he, as he recalled those games, he wasn't like he wouldn't have the same memory had he been listening to games today, where you turn it on and it's like, this is the velocity, this is the spin rate, this is the launch angle. I mean, you turn on a game today and it's like, it's people on the field, but if you were just focusing on the announcing and on the graphics, you would think it's like a computer simulation because it's just all numbers, and analytics and technology. And like a lot of fans, like they go to the ballpark to escape that. Like it's
Yeah.
the one part of their life that hasn't like intruded
It's
on.
real and tangible.
Yeah, and it's like this big, beautiful outdoor space, and like the last thing I think some people want to do is be like assaulted with numbers, And like I talked to one scout in the book, and he's like, I don't need a computer to tell me, the launch angle and the exit velocity of a ball to know that like this is a good hitter. He's like, I can just stand there
Yeah.
and see it, and it gets into even like the future of scouting and the role of kind of human intuition and knowledge and experience versus just computers. And I mean, that's another reason, honestly, why I think, in addition to saving money, why they cut these teams is this idea that we don't need 160 teams spread across the country, in far-flung places for these old school scouts to sit in the bleachers and watch guys. We can just bring them to a super modern facility in Florida or Arizona, hook them up to a bunch of machines, evaluate everything about them as a human, a human specimen, you know, um, and just make a determination based on that and just get rid of this whole infrastructure, and I don't think that's even true, but even if it was, you still have to ask, my goodness, like, is that really the future we want for the sport?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for a sport that feels so embedded in the fabric of American sort of passion and mythology, and you
Hmm.
talk about the sort of Bull Durham, field of dreams
Hmm.
esque space that, baseball feels like this real heart of Americana. And
Hmm.
to lose that to this very cold, calculating,
Hmm.
AI driven,
Yeah.
touchless, no human
Yeah.
element. And you do a great job of kind of weaving through all these different spaces that's taking over, and including
Yeah.
scouting.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, they want it to really take over every aspect of the game and going to the ballpark. I mean, like Bill has an example that there's this crazy quote, that one of these tech firms that partnered with the major league team, this press release they had where it's like, some AI driven whatever you put on your phone, and it kind of guides you through the entire, stadium experience, as they call it. And Bill's like, good heavens, he's like, people have been going to stadiums for 100 years and finding their beer and hot dog in their seat without the help of AI. Do we really need AI to, like, make this happen?
But that's increasingly, and I mean, that is increasingly a question that I have. This is probably too big a
Mm.
question for this episode, but like, do we constantly need this? And what do we lose when that becomes,
Hmm.
when we're looking at a map of the stadium on our screen instead of looking up and, maybe missing
Yeah.
chance encounter or
Hmm.
whatever that is that
Hmm.
happens. And I think missing using our own brains and sense of where we're going. This
Hmm.
is a quick side note. My husband and I have a rule that you can use Google Maps to get there, but you can't use it to get back.
That's
You
interesting.
have to sort of track where you are with your own senses to see if
Uh-huh.
you can get out of there yourself, because I
Yeah,
don't want to
yeah.
lose my ability to navigate anywhere, much less through a
Hmm.
stadium. And I think that it speaks again, that there is this sort of, you use the word sanitizing and homogenizing
Hmm.
of these things that no are important.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the homogenization, that's the other, I think, potential effect, side effect, or whatever you want to call it, of this private equity takeover of what remains of the minor leagues is like, one professor of sports business I spoke to, who was a former, as a younger guy, he was a former general manager of a minor league team. Um, he said, "Are we going to just now see like sort of the Home Depotization of the minor leagues?" So you used to have these like quirky ballparks in these obscure parts of the country, each one kind of uniquely kind of connected to its local identity. Um, and now, if it's the same owner that owns one in Georgia, and another one in Washington, and another one in Texas, sure, they're probably initially going to say, oh yeah, we're gonna keep the local groups in charge. But like, what if one starts to do really well and one's poor? Are they going to start to say, okay, well, whatever this promotion is down in Georgia, like let's try that one up in Washington, because it seems, and then before you know it, they all start to kind of just take on the same character and the same shape, and they lose what made them special in the first place.
Yeah, I think about this with Dollar General really
Mm.
stands to
Yeah.
supplant the local hardware store in more
Mm-hmm.
rural spaces that
Mm-hmm.
can't hold a Home Depot or a Lowe's
Mm-hmm.
or something larger like that. And when I go to my local hardware stores, which I make a point of trying to buy everything
Mm-hmm.
there because I know that dollar circulates very
Yeah.
differently within the
Yep.
local community,
Yep.
even than if I order a nut and bolt from Amazon, right? You have
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
amplifying effect. The multiplier
Mm-hmm.
effect is what it's called when you spend a
Mm-hmm.
dollar in a local community, and
Mm-hmm.
it'll circulate 3 to 4 times before leaving,
Wow.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
As opposed to something spent on Amazon that just goes directly
Mm-hmm.
out. And I actually
Mm-hmm.
pulled that quote from Mark Cryan because I thought it was so great, that
Yeah.
Home
Yeah.
Depotization of this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not what we want.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, I mean that the keeping the money in the community is key. I touch on that in the book, and then as you were speaking, the other, just trying to see what I quickly wrote down something else. It's escaping me now, but no, I mean that's critical, and the you know I'd much rather have that money filtered back into the pockets of those local employees than just get sort of vacuumed into the private equity world.
Yeah.
Oh, I know, I was going to say, the when it comes to sort of the homogenization, I mean, one example of this that we've already now seen in minor league baseball was, these quirky promotions are kind of what minor league baseball has always been famous for. And so, but what's happening now is it's becoming kind of instead of run by like the local owner, sort of PT Barnum character that have historically been associated with minor league baseball. Now it's these like Madison Avenue executives that are kind of trying to like do that, but in just a ham-handed way from 2,000 miles away.
Mhm.
And so this past summer, what they did was they're like, oh, quirky promotions, that seems cool. But they took like a Scandinavian, I don't know what even the company was, but it was a Scandinavian, I think, milk producer or something, and they were the sponsor, because they had developed some kind of a official connection with all of minor league baseball. And they said, okay, what we're going to do is this summer we're going to have every minor league team in the country wear this milk whatever uniform, as part of our relationship with this Scandinavian company, because it'll be really goofy and wacky and so funny or whatever. And it went over like a lead balloon, because it was just a clumsy attempt to kind of duplicate what these towns had already been doing, but with local businesses where it actually made sense. No one in Burlington, North Carolina, is going to get a kick out of the fact that their team's wearing some silly uniform of a team in or of a business based in Stockholm. That defeats the whole point of it. And that's just like one little sort of microcosm.
I love that because it's about relationships, right?
Yeah.
Like it's about relationships between this minor league team and the town, and then the minor league team and the people that are going to see them play.
If they were wearing the uniform of like the local diner, and you knew the guy that owned the diner and you knew the cooks that worked at the diner, then they get a kick out of that. But they don't care about some huge multinational company that is 10,000 miles across the ocean.
Yeah, and you talk about the way that even concession sales funnel into something like InBev versus funneling into a local brewery like they have at Batavia.
I always tried to get the local craft brewery was lucky enough to they had a little stand at the stadium, and I would always prefer that to like the the Bud Light or whatever the case may be, because your support. I knew the guy who owned the brewery, so I knew that at least some portion of that money would go to him, and the rest of it would go into his business, which made the town, which added to the civic. It was like a civic asset in the town.
Yeah, a civic asset. I like that because I think that's important. As we begin to wrap up, I want to be cognizant of your time, and I want to read something back to you. That I think you were worried about Bill Kaufman's poetry, but I hope that this disabuses you of that. So, as we begin to close, I thought we might talk about just like closing with that sense of community, especially over what is a sort of fractious America, as you're about to call it. And you say, Now that the season had ended, the evenings at Dwyer receding in my rearview mirror, I finally got it. It wasn't so much what was happening on the field that made the experience special, though of course loyal season ticket holders all wanted the Muck Dogs to win, and to some almost sacramental. The real magic was found in the bleachers among the fans, and it wasn't in the raucous atmosphere that had defined these final playoff games, but rather in the shared food, drink, and intimate conversation of those seemingly meaningless regular season games of midsummer, where gathering together on a regular basis to cheer on the Muck Dogs made everyone's life just a little bit better. Those ephemeral moments, so hard to capture, are the ones that satisfy the hunger we all have for acceptance and friendship, a hunger made more acute in a lonelier and more fractious America. Well, I just love this so much. I mean, I think it captures everything so beautifully, just from the sort of beauty of a sort of boring, and I don't mean boring, but boring midsummer baseball game where you get to know your neighbors, even if maybe you don't agree on everything in this wild and fractious world, and also capturing, I think, a sense of camaraderie and coming together that is so important and you do a great job detailing this in the book. Loneliness is very much an epidemic and very much a health issue. And so here is this thing that I hope throughout the course of the podcast we've kind of covered. I mean, it brings together so many different aspects of I think what can be right with America.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think the loneliness thing is important. You know, I was struck. Bill Kaufman's father, who and his parents, both of them would come to the games, and like I said, they're in their 80s. And you know, it was just so wonderful to see just the warmth with which they greeted other people and that they were greeted by in return. And you know, I think there was a day up there while I was reading the Wall Street Journal or a newspaper article about like these like robot companions that are now being built for like senior citizens, and I was just like, you know, and maybe there's some they're not totally without value in certain circumstances. Sure. But I thought to myself, like, if you the difference between, you know, Bill's parents, you know, Joe and Sandra, you know, going into the ballpark and seeing their neighbors every night of the summer, versus, you know, if one of them or both of them were at home with some, you know, AI robot shuffling around. I mean, there's some things that you just can't duplicate, and that's
I hope
that's
we
one
can
of
do
them.
better. You know,
Yeah,
exactly. Like, I hope we can do better than that.
Yeah. And then, you know, as far as just the bringing people together element, like I think one of the more special little vignettes that sort of illustrates that I mentioned in the book was, you know, the security guard who I got to know, who was a Desert Storm veteran. And, you know, and I never asked anyone like who they voted for. I mean, they're like, I just didn't care. You know, I wanted to know who they really were, you know, as a person. Like Betsy, I'm more interested in the fact that she loves Thomas Hardy, the writer, than I am that she, you know, voted whoever she voted for.
Yeah.
I mean, I could deduce generally probably who it was, like, but I just didn't. That wasn't what made them. I didn't want to just look at people as avatars of like a political ideology.
No, and you and I are both tired of yard signs. So.
Yeah. So and so, but this guy, the security guard, like I'm pretty sure, I might be wrong, that he looked like he was right out of like MAGA Trump central casting. You know, he had, you know, he was in the military just like I was. You know, lots of tattoos, lots of, you know, gun stickers on his car and whatnot. And then Betsy and Jenny, again, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty confident that they were very liberal, you know, just based on any number of things I observed with them. And so here you have these two groups, you know, that in many cases in our country would kind of be programmed to kind of like hate each other, and would probably never cross paths. And if they did, it would be, you know, in some kind of sort of a hostile way, whether online, virtually or whatever. But they got to know each other, you know, every night of the summer, to the point where they were like super close friends. They'd get to the stadium, the security guard would hug them, you know, ask them how they're doing. They would ask how he's doing. And it was like a really warm, real, genuine friendship, you know, between these groups that otherwise would, you know, probably be at each other's throats. And so you think to yourself, you know, you know, small town baseball is probably not, you know, going to solve every problem we have, but, you know, to the extent that we can kind of replicate these little front porch places where people can come together, that is at least a very small step in the right direction.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, after reading it, I think it might solve a surprising number of problems. Anyway, I mean, I was really struck at the passion I picked up for it, and I was hoping to maybe drive out to Batavia to catch a game this summer myself, and just struck at how much you communicate what is possible when we just kind of ask ourselves to enjoy a night of summer with our neighbors. And I can't tell you how much I appreciated the book. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And it just sunk me right into that space. And these characters are so vivid in my mind. And I really appreciate the many different stories that you tell throughout the book.
No, thank you for having me. I enjoyed our talk, and I'm always gratified when people take the time to read it, and even more so when they seem to appreciate it and understand it. So thank you.
Yeah, well, we'll have links to the book and links to your website and everything else so that people can find you. And I just appreciate it immensely. And I'm excited to dive into your other books as well after reading this.
Thank you. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.